Hello dear chess friends, I'm glad to introduce to you my course that has been designed to touch on all important areas of the chess game. We will be talking about how to calculate variations in chess, one of the main subjects in contemporary chess because the game evolves and becomes more and more computationally intensive. Then we will speak about how to attack and on the other side how to defend in chess. There are different methods of defense that are important to know and to understand what method applies to which situation. Besides, we will go over some general ending ideas and discuss typical mistakes at this stage of the game. I will show you some interesting examples from my own games to explain what mistakes are and how they could have been avoided. Additionally, we will speak about different strategic aspects of chess. We will cover different pawn structures such as isolated pawns, hanging pawns, as well as pawn formations with double pawns. Pawn sacrifice is another important element of chess strategy. I will show you some interesting examples of the pawn sacrifice for the initiative. We will take a look at some elements of piece play. You have to know where to place your pieces to get maximum benefits from them. The goal of this course is not to provide you with a comprehensive opening repertoire, but we will cover one system for the white side. It's the Sicilian with c3. It's a positional system for the white side that avoids long theoretical discussion, but allows you to get interesting positions. Last but not least, I will reveal to you my insight on the chess intuition. We will speak about creativity and improvisation in chess, how it is important to think outside the box and look for non-standard decisions. In this part of the course, I'm going to discuss the fundamental ways and approaches to calculating variations in chess. In fact, the ability to calculate variations precisely is at the heart of chess game. You can be an endgame expert, you can know the chess theory well, you can understand some strategic aspects of the game, but all of that will bring you no dividends unless you can compute variations precisely and avoid blunders. Specifically in this part of the course, I'm going to discuss with you the concept of candidate moves, what they are and how to find them based on the key features of the positions, what are forcing lines that you have to take into consideration when you make a list of candidate moves for yourself or anticipate plans and ideas of your opponents, as well as the concept of prophylactic thinking, which implies the habit to ask yourself the following question: what is my opponent going to do? What is his threat if he is on the move?
Hello everyone, today I would like to speak to you about my method for calculating variations in chess. Specifically, what I'm going to do today is to structure for you the process of decision making and explain step by step how do I choose the best continuation in a certain position, based on such key points as candidate moves, prophylactic thinking, and key features of the position. Okay, let's get started, and as a first example, please take a look at the positions that you can see on the diagram. In this position white to move, imagine it just happened in your game and your goal to find the best continuation here for white. Well, first thing that I would do is to make a list of candidate moves. And in my opinion, it is very important to take into consideration more than one option and to do it in a certain order. And specifically, I always start my calculation with forcing lines. Saying forcing lines, I mean checks, captures, and moves with a threat. And exactly in this order: checks, captures, and moves with a threat. All these moves limit potential responses of my opponent. That is why I believe it's so important to start your consideration with forcing lines. And I would like to emphasize it, if you have some problems with recognition tactical patterns during your games, considering forcing lines, considering all possible forcing lines can really help you to recognize tactical motifs for yourself and for your opponent, and to reduce the amount of blunders. Okay, so let's do it now. Let's apply the concept on practice. So we start with checks. In fact, as you can see, white has only two checks here. One of them is knight d5, but it is just suicidal move. Black can just take the knight, and there is no real compensation, black has to be winning. Another check, bishop g5, seems to be better relative to knight d5, but if black plays simple move king d7, the king attacks the knight, and you can see that the knight does not have a good square to retreat, and so we can conclude that bishop g5 was a meaningless move, black just winning after this move. Okay, checks do not work here. But what about other moves with a threat? In fact, it is very important before you think about your own plans, about your own threats. It's to anticipate the potential responses of your opponent, to anticipate his threats and his plans. And as you can see, in these particular positions, two white pawns are hanging, the pawn on c2 and another one on g2. Therefore, before white starts his own attack, he should take care of these 2 pawns. Okay, because black's intents are pretty obvious in this position, to take either on c2 or on g2, we don't have a lot of candidate moves, and basically we can limit our list to only 2 continuations. Short castle, white protects the pawn on g2 and ignores the pawn on c2, and bishop takes on d4. So white eliminates the knight, that attacks the pawn on c2, and black has to retake the bishop. Black cannot play queen takes on g2 in view of bishop f3. White attacks the queen and just keeps extra piece. White is winning. Okay, we have 2 candidate moves, short castle and bishop takes the knight. Now we have to make a choice, what to consider first. Bishop takes the knight or short castle. And in fact, it is very important to start your calculation with the most principal continuations. Why? Because if you figure out that one of them is winning, you just don't need to spend your time calculating alternatives. You save time and you can invest your time, you can invest this save time into your future calculation. So-called time management, which is also very important for chess. Okay, how do we make this decision between short castle and bishop takes the knight? Actually, because so far we cannot figure out which option is better for white, we should rely on our chess instinct, on our chess intuition. And as for me, short castle seems to be more natural rather than bishop takes on d4, in spite of the fact that bishop takes the knight is a forcing line, it's a capture. Why? Because white secures his king, and white keeps his dark squared bishop. Maybe, we don't know so far, maybe white does not need to trade his dark squared bishop for the knight immediately and can postpone doing so. And if short castle works, it does not make sense to play bishop takes on d4 and to give black additional opportunities. So, let's start with short castle. In fact, before you play either short castle or bishop takes on d4 in your real game, you should do another important thing. You should be able to anticipate the potential responses of your opponent. Again, prophylactic thinking. You should flip a board in your mind and make a list of candidate moves for black. So let's do it now. Let's flip a board. But first of all, let's highlight the main features of the position to be sure that we include all reasonable moves in our list and we are not missing something important. Okay, white played short castle. White secured his king. His king is now safe, while his black's counterpart got stuck in the center. White is leading in development. White has the advantage of 2 bishops. And the only potential issue for white in this position is an unstable position of his knight on c7. Therefore, besides considering forcing lines like knight takes on c2, queen takes on c2, or knight takes the bishop on e2, so besides considering all these forcing lines, we should also take into consideration moves aimed at the knight on c7. And among these moves, I would list queen c6. Black can play this move either immediately or after first knight takes the bishop on e2 and then queen c6. King d7. Again, black can play it right now or after trading his knight for the bishop. And last but not least, I would include in the list knight f6 move. And it is not just a regular development move. In fact, knight on f6 plays a very important role. It takes control over the d5 square. And if black is able to coordinate his pieces, for example, if he can play rook d8, king f8, he can just attack the knight in the future by playing the same queen c6 or rook d7. So there is no hurry with attacking this knight, maybe. We will see. Okay, it looks like we make the full list, and let's start our calculation. I'm going to start with knight takes on c2, as it's pretty easy to oppose this line. So after knight takes on c2, let's flip the board. Now we calculate the position for white. So again, we use the same method. We start with forcing lines and specifically with checks. So, and if you think about possible checks in this position, you can recognize that white has a powerful series of checks that starts with bishop c5. So black has only moved king f6, queen d8, another check, king g6, and finally bishop d3. It's a pin, it's deadly pin, white wins the queen, and that's it, the game is over for black. So we can stop our calculation of knight takes on c2 and evaluate it as forcefully winning for white. Okay, let's try queen takes on c2 now. It seems to be more logical. Black is defender, and as you probably know, it's favorable for defender to simplify the position in order to reduce the dynamic element. And after black plays queen takes on c2, white cannot really avoid queen's trading. Again, considering white's moves, we start with forcing lines. Checks do not work here, and let's consider captures. As analysis shows, the best bet for white here is queen takes the queen, knight takes, and bishop a7. White attacks the rook, and the main idea behind this line that after knight takes the rook, white first takes the knight, and next move white will take the rook, and white keeps extra piece. Black cannot protect the rook, black cannot do anything to restore the material balance in this position. White is winning. Okay, but in your game and in your calculation, you can start with another capture. You can start with bishop takes the knight. Now the best continuation for black, queen takes the queen. If queen takes the knight, I think the simplest decision for white is just to play rook c1, attacking the queen. Queen cannot go on d6 in view of bishop c5, and again white wins the queen. Otherwise, white has a lot of resources how to accumulate the pressure. He can play bishop c5, he can take the pawn on e5 if black leaves this pawn unprotected, and rook c5, and so on. So the position seems to be very dangerous for black. His king is very weak in the center. Black's pieces are undeveloped, so we don't need to calculate this position until checkmate. So we just evaluate it as very dangerous for black and clearly better for white. Okay, so queen d1. Let's calculate queen d1. So rook takes on d1. Black takes the bishop, rook takes d4. Again, we can stop our calculation here and let's evaluate this position. So what I can see is that in spite of the material balance, white has more active pieces. A lot of black pieces are still on the initial positions, are still undeveloped. White is going to accumulate the pressure by bringing his rook on e-file with different ideas of discovered attack, bishop a6 and bishop c4 and so on. So for me it's obvious that White has to be better in this endgame. Probably Black has to give up the pawn in order to protect his king somehow. And again, I just want to say that if you start your calculation with bishop takes the knight on d4, if you was not able to find the idea with bishop a7 immediately, and you just see this endgame, you evaluate this endgame as favorable for White, don't look for best continuation. You will have the second chance later if your opponent really plays queen takes on c2 in the game, but so far, one good line should be enough for you. Don't waste your time. You can need this time in the future. Maybe your opponent will never play queen takes on c2 and you just wasted your time if you tried to find better continuations than bishop takes the knight on d4. Okay, so we are done with queen takes on c2. Let's try king d7 now. So Black attacks the knight with the king, but there is one visible drawback of this move. Black puts his king under the pin. And the first idea that comes to my mind is to play c3. White attacks the knight, knight cannot legally go, so Black has to take the knight on c7, but after c takes on d4, again, we can stop our calculation. We don't need to further calculate this position, as White's advantage is pretty obvious. White solves the problem with his knight on c7, White keeps the advantage of two bishops, and White got additional c-file at his disposal. The Black king is still very unsafe, still in the center of the board, and probably all these factors means that the position should be winning for White. So we stop at this point and we evaluate this position as favorable for White. And the same with king d6 or king d8. We just skip. Just White still plays c3 and it leads to the same position. Okay, now let's try queen c6. Queen c6. Black attacks the knight with the queen, but this move leaves the knight on d4 unprotected, and White can take on d4, e takes, and queen takes on d4. And it looks like after queen takes on c7, White can take the pawn on g7, and at first glance, the position seems to be absolutely winning for White, as Black cannot really protect the rook on h8, and White will have a decisive material advantage at first glance after queen takes the rook on h8. Okay, so let's try knight takes on e2. It's forcing line, it's check, queen takes on e2, and again, now Black can attack the knight either by playing queen c6 or king d7. In the case of king d7, White cannot protect the knight, but he got at his disposal another important resource. Now he can play knight d5. And if you are able to find the idea, if you are able to recognize that Black cannot take the knight in view of rook d1, pin, and White wins the queen, you can quickly stop your calculation of king d7 line. So, let's try queen c6 instead of king d7. Queen c6. So now White cannot play knight d5, but a noticeable drawback of this move, Black just weakened his central e5 pawn. And the first idea that comes to my mind to attack this pawn by playing either bishop f4 or bishop g5. Okay, let's start with bishop g5. Bishop g5 is check. Black has to play f6. If he plays king d7, I can still play knight d5, or what's even better, I can play rook d1 check, king takes, queen e5. Next move I take the rook on b8 and white is winning. f6, and after f6 I can just take the pawn on e5. Black probably can still fight if he plays king f7, and it looks like a fork, but I can play queen f4, and black cannot legally take the bishop. Maybe it's not the best bet for white, but it's just one opportunity. And besides, I can take the pawn on a6 first in order to open the h2b8 diagonal for my queen, and after b takes, queen takes e5, and queen takes the rook. F takes the bishop, and again, I would evaluate this position as favorable for white, as black still has some problems with his king, his pieces are still undeveloped, and it looks like white has enough time to bring his forces to create some threats against the black king or to advance the pawns on the queen side. So I would prefer to play this position for white, certainly. Okay, and additionally, as analysis shows, white has interesting option to play bishop b6. Again, it attacks the pawn on e5, and black cannot take the bishop in view of fork, knight d5. White wins the queen. Black still has to play f6, and now white, for example, can play queen e3 with the idea bishop c5, or rook d1 with the idea knight d5, and black still cannot take the bishop on b6. And even if white did not win some material immediately, the position still seems to be pretty dangerous for black. His king is still unsaved, and again, I would prefer to play this position for white, and it's definitely better for white, this position. But again, I would like to stress, you don't need to make a choice between bishop g5, bishop f4, or bishop b6 in your calculation. If you see one option and you believe that this option is favorable for you, just stop at this point, and you will have a chance to make a new list of candidate moves and to choose the best continuation later if your opponents really plays, if your opponent really plays this continuation, this line. Okay, so, okay, one left, and let's see what happens after knight takes on f6, our last candidate move. So, as I already said, black's intent to play rook d8, king f8, and if black stabilizes the position of his king, white can be in danger. His knight on c7 can be in danger. So what white should play precisely? White should play vigorously in this position. So let's consider forcing lines. Knight d5 check, it does not work. Let's try capture. Bishop takes the knight. But it looks like after queen takes on d4, black has to be fine either in an endgame or in a middle game, as white cannot really play knight d5, cannot free his knight, and yeah, now I would prefer to play this position for black. Okay, so bishop takes on d4 does not work. Let's try bishop d3, another tempting move with a threat. White attacks the queen. So queen has to go on c6, attacking the knight on c7. So rook e1, with the idea if black takes the knight, bishop takes the knight on d4, and again this exchange is favorable only for white. White would be happy to trade his bet knight on c7 for the good knight on d4. So black has to avoid it. Black can play king f8. So again, it looks like white cannot go with his knight. If bishop takes the knight on d4, e takes on d4, and white cannot protect this knight. Probably the best practical chance for white is to try to open lines by playing f4. But after queen takes, f takes, queen takes on e5. I don't really see how white can accumulate his pressure, how white can find resources to compensate his lack of material. So black has pretty solid position, no real threats for white, and yeah, I think black should be fine here. Okay, what else? We considered bishop d3, bishop takes on d4. Another forcing line starts with c3. After c3, black has to take the bishop on e2. Otherwise, for example, if he plays knight c2, there is checkmate in 1, bishop c5. If he plays knight e6, white is happy to trade again his bad knight for the knight on e6, and we can just stop at this point. If we see that trading is possible, white solve his main problem, and that's it. It means that white is clearly better. So knight takes on e2, queen takes on e2, and again, black has the same moves that we should take into account: queen c6 and king d7, or king d6, king d8. So let's start with queen c6. Queen c6. Again, as before, we can notice that this move weakens the position of the pawn on e5, but if we compare this position with similar one that we discussed earlier, we can notice that the position of the knight on f6 is not really helpful for black in this position, because black does not have an important defensive resource to play f6, as he could do earlier. And for example, if white plays bishop f4, black cannot play f6. He has to take the knight, bishop takes the pawn on e5, the queen is hanging, queen retreats, and white takes the rook on b8, and white is winning. The game is over for black. So it's funny. If we compare this position with the similar one that we discussed earlier, when black played knight takes on e2, let's see it. So with this one, remember? So we discussed the position that arises after knight takes, queen takes, and queen c6. So it's very similar to the position that we discussed now, but the only difference that black has his knight on f6, white has his pawn on c3. And at first glance, it looks favorable for black. He did a useful development move. He developed his knight, and white just moved his pawn from c2 to c3. But in fact, as we could see, it just makes the pawn on e5 weak, and in fact, inclusion these moves is favorable for white. Okay, let's go back. So knight f6, c3. So queen c6, bishop f4 should be winning for white, and let's see another principal continuation. King d8. King d8. Let's see king d8. It seems to be more natural than king d7, as it does not close the diagonal for the light squared bishop. So king d8. Again, the position is very concrete. White has to play precisely. White cannot play knight d5 in this position, because black can just take with them. Actually, white can play knight d5. Yes, white can play knight d5 in this position, and if queen takes on d5, rook d1, it's pin, and if knight takes on d5, there is a discovered attack, bishop g5 or bishop b6, and white wins the queen. So Probably the simplest decision after king d8 to play knight d5. Okay, let's try king d7. It looks unnatural, but maybe it's better, because in the case of knight d5, black can just play knight takes on d5 and there is no discovered attack, because the king occupies the light square. Okay, king d7. White cannot play knight d5. White should be creative in this position. White cannot move his bishop because of pin. Queen's move do not work effectively, and the only way for white to maintain the initiative is to sacrifice temporarily the knight by playing f4. White plays f4. So, king takes, and f takes on e5. And surprisingly, f4 move contains very interesting tactical motif, the motif of the same discovered attack. So black cannot go with his knight. Black cannot play either knight d5, knight g4, knight d7 and so on in view of bishop b6. Again, white wins the queen. And additionally, black cannot just take the pawn on e5 because of bishop f4, pin. White wins the queen. Probably the most challenging continuation is bishop g4, counterattack. Black counterattacks the queen. But again, bishop b6 works perfectly for white. And if king takes on b6, rook takes the knight on f6 with a check. Otherwise, if king retreats, let's say king d7, rook d1 check, king e8, queen f2, and in spite of the fact that black has an extra piece, the rook on d1 is hanging, the pawn on s5 is hanging, the position seems to be winning for white. Black cannot take the pawn on e5 in view of pin, rook e1. Black cannot really take the rook because e takes the knight, and white is threatening to play f takes on g7. Rook e1 is another powerful threat. And honestly, I don't see how black can oppose a variety of white's threats in this position. The position is very dangerous for black. His king is very unsafe, and material advantage does not compensate the weakness of the black king in this position. Okay. Also, let's see what happens if black plays king c8 instead of king d7. Now white can trade the queens, and after knight takes, play rook f7. And again, white has number of threats in this position. Rook c7 is one threat with followed by different discovered attacks. Rook f4 is another threat. Double attack, attacking the knight on e4 and attacking the bishop on g4 simultaneously. So it looks like this endgame has to be winning for white. Okay. Okay, it looks like we are done with calculating all candidate moves after short castle. Okay, at this point a logical question arises. Is it enough to make a conclusion that short castle is the best continuation for white? Is it enough to make a decision to play short castle in a real game? Well, personally for me it's not enough. And I usually always check my calculation, so-called second round of calculation. And in my opinion, it is very important to check your calculation in order to avoid blunders, in order to be sure that you was able to recognize all tactical patterns when you calculated variation in your mind. It's pretty difficult to calculate long variation in your mind, and it can be pretty easy to miss something. So for this reason, I always go through all these lines for the second time and try to anticipate more options for my opponents. Try to anticipate all forcing lines. Try to consider all captures or checks and all moves with the threat one more time. Okay, let's do it now. So, we do it in the same order. We start with knight takes, We start with knight takes on c2. So, knight c2 is losing forcefully. So, we just calculate the same checks. Bishop c5, queen d8, bishop d3. So, no room for black to change this line. So, knight c2 is definitely losing for black. Again, queen takes on c2. We know we have two options, queen takes and bishop a7, queen takes the queen and bishop a7, or bishop takes the knight and game. And again, both of them seems to be pretty forceful, and it looks like black cannot add any value to these lines and hence his move somehow. Okay, let's try queen c6. Queen c6, bishop takes, queen takes. So maybe at this point black is not obligated to take the knight. We consider so far only queen takes the knight on c7. Maybe black can play knight f6. Let's try it. But honestly, I don't think that it changes the pictures for the black, because white has a pretty simple move and it's forcing line, it's check, queen e5 check. Black cannot go on the d file because of rook d1. Black has to play probably king f8 or bishop e6, and in both cases the white knight on c7 will be safe. The queen on e5 helps to support this knight, and no, I don't think that we need to further calculate this position. Obviously white has to be better here. Okay, let's see what happens after queen takes on c7 one more time. It's forcing line. Queen takes on g7. So I don't see how black can keep his rook. Actually, black cannot keep his rook. But at the same time, my experience hints me that it's too early to stop here, because there is a pretty common tactical motif with sacrificing this corner rook and creating some threats using the unpleasant position of the queen at the corner of the board. So maybe we need to further calculate this line to be sure that the white queen cannot be trapped at some point. So let's do it. Knight f6. So black has to play with the knight in order to open the line for his rook. Queen takes the rook, and suddenly I realize that black has some interesting resources in this position. So one interesting resource is to play bishop g4, and white actually has to give up his bishop. But in fact, after queen g7, in spite of the fact that black temporarily restores the material balance, the position is still very, very dangerous for black because of the unsafe position of his king, still the same important factor. So white can just play rook e1, and the pin seems to be almost deadly for black. For example, after queen takes on c2, white can play queen g3, forcing line, tempting move. White attacks the rook on b8, and additionally white can play queen e5, queen e3, queen e5, attacks simultaneously the bishop on e2 and the knight on f6. So I don't see honestly how black can oppose all these white threats. So it looks like white gets decisive material advantage after bishop g4. Okay, let's go back. Bishop g4 does not work. Let's try something else. And if you are looking for opportunities, you can be able to recognize another interesting idea for black. Bishop h3. And the idea behind this move is that white surprisingly cannot keep his queen in this position anymore. If he plays queen g7, black plays rook g8 and queen cannot retreat on h6 in view of checkmate. Rook takes, king h1, and queen takes, checkmate. So, it looks like white has to give up his queen. He can do it either immediately or after queen g7, rook g8, queen takes the rook on g8, but let's do it right now. Queen takes, and g takes the bishop. Okay, it's pretty long line, so let's stop here and let's try to evaluate this position. Well, at first glance, white has a pretty big material advantage. He has 2 rooks and 2 extra pawns versus black's queen. Usually it's enough to evaluate the position in white's favor, but on the other hand, there are other important factors that we should take into consideration when we evaluate this position. In fact, we cannot say that white has absolutely healthy pawn structure. So white, first of all, has double pawns on the h file. And additionally, and I would say that it is the most important factor, after white played g takes on h3, he weakens the position of his king. And this factor is really important because black can bring his knight, for example, on f4 or on h4 and try to create some threats against the white king. And for this reason, for the reason of potential weakness of the white king, I cannot definitely say that this position is so clearly better for white. If white is able to coordinate his pieces, if white is able to bring his bishop on the big diagonal and to restrict potential black's counterplay, probably yes, white will be better in this endgame. But the position is very concrete, and in a real game it cannot be not so easy for white to oppose black's threats in this position. For example, let's see, let's continue this line a little bit. For example, black can play queen e5. So queen e5, black attacks the pawn on b2. Black does not really attack the bishop on e2 because of rook e1 pin, so white can play b3 and queen f5. So again, double attack. Black attacks the pawn on h3. Black attacks the pawn on c2, and another important idea behind this move, black prevents the transportation of the white bishop on the big diagonal, so white cannot play bishop f3. While black's plan is pretty obvious. He wants to play knight d5, knight a4, and the pawn on h3 is hanging, so without some further analysis I cannot say that this position is so safe for white. Intuitively, I say that black has enough counterplay in this position. Okay, so as you can see, thanks to our second round of calculation, we were able to recognize these additional tactical motifs that we missed when we calculated black's candidate moves for the first time, and now it's not so obvious for white whether is short castle the best move for white or not. And to decide it, we certainly need to calculate another candidate move. We need to calculate and figure out what happens if bishop takes the knight on d4. So, let's take a break now, and when we are back, we will see what happens if bishop takes the knight on d4. We will calculate our second candidate move. Let's take a break now. Okay, we are back, and now let's see what happens if white plays bishop takes the knight on d4, our second candidate move. So, bishop takes, black has a choice. As we already know, queen takes on g2 does not work well for black in view of bishop f3, and white has a decisive material advantage. So, let's try queen takes the bishop instead. It seems to be pretty natural. Black tries to simplify the position, to trade off the queens, which is usually favorable for defender. now the most principal continuation for white. Queen takes, e takes, and long castle. White attacks the pawn, and the only question here is whether or not black can create some threats against the knight on c7. So let's try to capture this knight. Black can do it by moving his king towards this knight, and for example, if he plays king d8, white can easily escape after he plays knight d5. So there is no more risk for the knight. White is going to play rook takes on d4 and just play this endgame with extra pawn. White has to be winning. Okay. Instead of king d8, black can try king d6. It does not allow white to play knight d5, but instead white has another powerful knight's move in this position, knight e8 check. And it is not just a check, it's double attack. Next move, white takes the pawn on g7, and there is no risk for the knight on g7 at all. This knight will escape through h5 square if black tries to trap this knight. And so again, we can conclude that the endgame has to be winning for white. So queen takes on d4 is not good for black, and it looks like black has to play e takes on d4. Now, as before we make a decision, we have to make a list of candidate moves for white. So let's do it. As for me, I would certainly include in the list short castle. It's a pretty natural move. White finishes the development, white secures the king and wants to bring the rook on e-file as soon as possible. Additionally, I would take into consideration c4 move, with the idea to support the knight on c7, because as we know, this knight is very unstable, and if white is able to bring this knight back, white definitely will have better chances due to unsafe position of the black king. And what's more, I would also consider queen d2 move. It's a tempting move. The idea behind this move to play queen g5, attacking the pawn on g7. Additionally, white can use the queen on d2 to protect the knight by playing queen a5 at some point. Queen b4 check is possible in the future. And what's more, playing queen d2, white prepares long castle, and perhaps in these circumstances it makes sense for white to castle long rather than short, and to use the position of his rook on the d file. Okay, so let's start our calculation, and again, we need to decide what to consider first. We make this choice based on our chess instinct, and as for me, I would start with short castle, because it's just very appealing for me to bring king into safety and start attacking in the center. However, before white plays short castle, as usual, we have to anticipate the potential responses of our opponent, and if we are doing so, we will be able to realize that after black played e5 takes on d4, he got at his disposal very important e5 square. And now black can use this square to attack the white knight. So after short castle, black can play queen e5, and as you can see, white cannot even take the pawn on d4, as he could do when black played queen c6. So knight cannot go, there are no squares for the knight, white cannot protect this knight, and so the only chance for white in this position to give up the knight and to bring the pieces in the center as soon as possible and try to create some threats against the black king. So let's try to do it. Rook e1, queen takes the knight, queen takes on d4, and now I think black can even play knight f6, ignoring all discovered attacks, because if white plays either bishop a6 or bishop c4, black can always block check on the e-file by playing bishop e6. I don't think that there is any real danger for the black in this position. Or what's probably even better, instead of knight f6, black can just play king f8, protecting the pawn with the king, and next, black can either play knight f6 or knight e7, and again, I don't see any real compensation for the minor piece, and obviously 1 pawn is not a good compensation here, so I think black should be fine. Okay, short castle does not work, we exclude it from our list, so let's do another candidate move. Let's do c4. So, as I said, playing c4, white wants to play knight d5, and let's make a list of candidate moves for black, taking into account white's intent. First of all, I would consider forcing lines for sure. Queen takes the pawn on g2, d takes on c3. These two moves are forcing lines. And additionally, I would consider knight f6 move, because as before, it takes control over the d5 square, and black just develops, and he wants to play rook d8, king f8, and postpone playing against the knight on c7. Okay, let's start with queen takes on g2. Now, of course, white does not want to retreat with his rook. Instead, bishop f3, tempting move, bishop attacks the queen, queen g5. And now, if white takes the pawn on d4 immediately, there is queen a5 check, and the position is not so clear. So, again, as before, black can give up the rook on h8 and take the knight on c7, and I believe black will have some compensation in this position for sure, and mainly because the unsafe position of the white king. So, to avoid this complication, it makes sense after queen g5 to play knight d5 first, king f8, and queen takes the pawn on d4. So, at this point, I think we can stop and start evaluating the position. Well, as for me, in spite of the fact that white was not able to castle yet, the position of his king is still safer than the position of his black's counterpart. And even if white was not able to castle long, he can put his king on d1, or he can put his king on f1 after he plays h4 to bring his rook on e1, and I believe that white has more active pieces and will be able to create threats against the black king and use his latent development. So I would certainly evaluate this position in white's favor, and I would stop my calculation at this point. Okay, let's try d takes on c3 instead. Again, we don't want to retake this pawn automatically. Instead, we consider first of all forcing lines, and we can easily notice that after knight d5 check, king f8, knight takes on c3, black cannot take the pawn on g2 in view of queen d8, checkmate in 1, so black has to take control over the d8 square, queen e7 for example, and after short castle, again there is no need to further calculate this position. Obviously white has better chances here due to his latent development, due to his more active pieces, and the unsafe position of the black king. The same factors again. Okay. So we considered queen takes on g2, d takes on c3, and now let's switch to knight f6. The most solid continuation in this position. And now, in order to play knight d5, white will need to sacrifice the pawn. So short castle, the most logical move, and queen e5. So, again, white cannot take the pawn on d4, white cannot protect the knight, so he has to play knight d5. Knight takes, c takes, queen takes. Let's continue this line. Rook c1 seems to be pretty logical. Preparing bishop c4 and also heading to c7. Bishop e6. And again, as for me, we can stop at this position and let's evaluate it. So, in my opinion, white definitely has some compensation for the pawn. So the black king is still in the center, and white can put his rook on the 7th rank by playing rook c7, or he can create some pressure on the e file after he plays bishop c4 and rook e1. However, I don't think that this compensation is enough for white to get any decisive advantage or create any real threats against the black's king. In fact, the position of black is not so dangerous, and he needs just few moves to stabilize his position, to bring his king into safety. He wants to play rook h8 goes on d8, or rook h8 goes on c8, then king f8, and so on. And additionally, I think the passed d pawn can help black to create some counterplay in the center. So, taking into account all these factors, I would say that this position has to be dynamically equal. So, white has some compensation, but this compensation is not enough to get an advantage. This compensation can be enough to equalize the game and to compensate some material disbalance. And, for example, if white plays rook c7, king f8, queen d2, queen d6, and even after rook c1, g6, queen h6, and king g8, I don't see any real threats. I don't see a lot of danger for black, so black can advance d pawn in the future to disrupt white's pieces, and so I think black can hold this position. Okay, so let's go back. So we are done with c4, and now let's calculate queen d2 move. Queen d2 move. So, as I said, the queen is heading to g5 or b4, a5. Again, before we make this move, we make a list of candidate moves for black and calculate them. So one of them for sure will be queen e5 attacking the knight, another one can be queen takes on g2, and I would also consider king's moves, king d8, king d7, king d6 attacking the knight. Okay, but let's start with queen takes on g2. Queen takes on g2. So the rook is under an attack. Long castle seems to be very logical, protecting the rook and securing the king. Now, if black does not play queen c6, white just grabs the pawn on d4, and I don't think black will be able to survive. So queen c6 is the only chance. But now again, if we apply the same method, if we consider first of all forcing lines, checks, we will be able to find simple tactical decisions. So queen b4, first check. So if black plays king d8, white can just grab the pawn with the rook, and after king c7, rook c4 check. Otherwise, if black plays queen d6, white can play knight d5, and this just forces black to go with his king farther in the center, and obviously with such weak king, black cannot survive in this position. Okay, so queen g2 seems to be favorable for white. Let's try queen e5. Queen e5. So, again, we do the same thing. We make a list of candidate moves for white, and first of all, we consider checks, captures, and moves with a threat. So, one possible checks, queen b4, queen g5 is bad check, we don't consider it, queen d4, bad capture, we don't consider it, and additionally, if you keep looking for interesting resources in this position, you can be able to find an interesting move of queen f4. So, the idea behind this move that if queen takes on f4, knight d5, then knight retakes the queen, and this endgame has to be better for white because black has a permanent weakness on d4, and at some point white will probably win this pawn and just get better endgame. Okay, but we start with checks, so queen f4 it's our candidate move, but we start our consideration with queen b4 check. So, again, black has a choice, and now the most logical continuation, probably king d7. If black plays queen d6, as before, white has a resource of knight d5, and if king e6, queen takes the pawn on d4, queen takes the knight, bishop c4, and the game is over for black. Okay, let's try king d7. Again, we need to make a list of candidate moves, and my first intent would be to play long castle, to say the truth, because I see that white cannot keep the knight, and so it makes sense to sacrifice it and just to bring rooks in the center as soon as possible. So short castle. However, if I start calculating this line, I can recognize a very important defensive resource for my opponent. And indeed, after king takes on c7, rook takes on d4, white is threatening to play rook c4, and but black can oppose this threat if he plays knight e7, with the idea after rook e4, rook c4 to play knight c6, very important intermediate move. So black counterattacks, and with his knight on c6, the black king feels more safer, and again, I don't see how white can maintain his initiative in this position. Black has to be fine. Okay, so long castle was my first intent, but it does not work. I keep looking for alternatives. And another idea that could come to my mind is to play either knight d5 or knight b5. So, if I play knight d5, I want to force black to bring his queen on the d file, and then when I play rook d4, I will play it with a tempo, attacking the black queen. And when I play knight b5, I just want to bring my bishop into the attack. After a takes on b5, I probably going to castle, and then to play bishop b5 at some point, and use my bishop to create threats. So, let's see both of these options. Let's start with knight d5. So again, black has to take this knight, otherwise white will solve all his problems and keep his positional advantage. So queen takes, long castle. So, again, white has a clear threat, rook takes the pawn on d4, black has to run with his king. If he goes on the queen side, king c7, rook just takes the pawn on d4, queen g5, king b1. White has a lot of threats in this position, and rook c4, queen d6, black cannot just play knight e7, for example, with the idea knight c6 in view of checkmate in 1, queen d6. So a lot of threats, black are very undeveloped, and he does not have enough resources to support his king in this position, definitely. So we can stop here, and the position is winning for white. Okay, probably the best bet for black is to keep his king in the center by playing king e8. Again, rook takes the pawn with a tempo. Again, it was the reason to play knight d5. I can bring my rook on d file with a tempo. Queen g5, f4. Another aggressive move. It is very important to play aggressively to accumulate the pressure each move when you're sacrificing material and when you're attacking. queen e6, queen e7, and now white can either play queen b6 or queen d2, and I believe that in both cases white's initiative is strong enough to compensate the material disbalance and to create real threats against the black king. And for example, even if white plays less active continuation queen d2 after knight f6, rook e1, bishop e6, and f5, black cannot really oppose white's threats on the e file. If bishop takes the pawn, bishop b5, discovered attack, white wins the queen. So I don't think, as I said, that black has enough time to secure his king and to coordinate his pieces in this position. He spent too much time by playing with his king back and forward, and all white's pieces are perfectly placed. F-pawn helps white to create pressure on the e-file. So taking into account all these factors again, we can stop our calculation and evaluate this position in white's favor. Okay, so knight d5 was one option, and knight b5 another move that could come to your mind if you looking for opportunities to sacrifice the knight. For example, after a takes on b5, long castle. After, if queen takes the bishop on e2, rook takes on d4, or queen takes on d4, I believe in both cases white has to checkmate forcefully. So king c7, bishop b5, and again black has no time to develop his pieces if he plays knight e7, rook e1, and yeah, I don't think black can survive in this position. So it looks like after queen e5 and queen b4, black has real difficulties with his king, and white has enough resources to attack the king. So let's try king's moves. First of all, let's try king d7. King d7. Again, white cannot just go with his knight. Knight does not have squares, and if white just castles, king takes the knight, rook h1. Probably it can be also not so bad for white, but after queen e5, the position of black is still kind of solid, and maybe black can still fight. But I believe there is an easier way. Queen g5, it's forcing line. Before we play long castle, we should be sure that queen g5 does not work. If it does not work, we can play long castle. So queen g5. And the main idea behind this move, if queen takes on c7, is not to take the pawn on g7, but play queen g3 and take the rook on b8. It's a very important idea. If white just wants to take the pawn on g7, it could be not enough. Again, we remember about the tactical motif with sacrificing the corner rook. But because white has very important resource with queen g3, it has to be enough. Okay, after queen g5, knight e7 seems to be logical, and long castle. Again, there is no hurry to take the pawn on g7. If queen takes, rook g8, queen takes and king c7, white has no time to create threats because his king is not castled yet, so it's much more important to castle the king rather than to take some pawns. So long castle seems to be more promising. Definitely black cannot take the bishop on e2 in view of rook e1. And next white just takes the knight on e7. Sorry. If black plays king c7 instead of queen e2, White can play bishop f3, queen e6, rook e1, again winning the knight on e7. f6, another tempting move. But after queen takes on g7, king takes, bishop f3, again the same idea. If queen e6, rook e1, and if rook g8, queen f7, queen e6, white has enough resources to get advantage in an endgame. After queen takes, bishop takes, rook e1, and if king d6, rook takes, and then white plays c4, white will retake the piece back and get material advantage in the endgame. Okay, so king d7 allows white to get an advantage after he plays queen g5. King d8 seems to be very similar, so we will not consider it separately. Let's try king d6. King d6 can be better for black if white plays queen g5, because it takes control over the d5 square, and it does not close the diagonal for the light squared bishop. But again, if we start our consideration with forcing lines and specifically with checks in this point, we can recognize another interesting tactical resource of knight e8, queen takes on e8, queen d4 check, and if black plays king c7, queen f4 check, and queen takes the rook on b8. Otherwise, if black plays king e7, again white can postpone to take some material. Instead, white secures his king, long castle, bishop e6, queen b4, king f6, and now white can forcefully win the rook after he plays queen h4, g5, and queen d4. And that's it, the game is over for black. White has a decisive material advantage. Okay, it looks like after queen d2 we considered all possible candidate moves, all reasonable candidate moves for black. We calculated each of them and we decided that each of them leads to a comfortable position for white. Now, as with short castle, we do the same thing. We do the second round of our calculation, we check our calculation, and once we decide that there is no new resources for black, we are ready to make a decision, and we are ready to play queen d2 in our game. We are ready to make a decision between short castle and queen d2, and we play queen d2 in our game. Okay, we are done with the first comprehensive example, and next I would like you to apply and practice the concepts of candidate moves and prophylactic thinking, and to calculate the position that you can see on the diagram. In this particular position, black to move, and black is considering to play rook b4. Rook b4. So, your task is to calculate this move, to evaluate it, and to decide whether you play it in your game or not. So, before black plays rook b4, it's important to make a list of candidate moves for white, taking into consideration forcing lines first of all. So you calculate each of these candidate moves, and then in the process of your calculation, you take into consideration first of all checks, captures, and moves with a threat for yourself as well for your opponent, and try to calculate as deeply as possible. Do not stop your calculation until you believe there is no more forcing lines that can change the outcome of the game. And that's it. So, if you want to check yourself, just push the stop button right now and go back to the solution when you are ready. Okay, so. Okay, we are ready to discuss this position. Actually, this position happened in a game between two grandmasters. Topalov was white and Petr Svidler was black. And Svidler, playing black, played rook b4 move. For sure, before he played this move, he did some calculation and he anticipated what Topalov could play, and one move that he should take into consideration for sure in this position is Queen c3. Basically, it's the only move if white is fighting for advantage in this position, otherwise black just captures the pawn on d4 or forces white rook to protect this pawn by playing rook d1. So, Queen c3, the most principal continuation here. White attacks the knight on c6 that protects the rook on b4. If knight leaves, the rook on b4 will be under an attack. After Queen c3, the only move that black has is knight takes on d4. Otherwise, as we know, white will get material advantage. So knight takes, white has 3 captures, knight takes the knight, queen takes the rook, and queen takes on c7. If knight takes the knight, rook retakes this knight, and again, you can stop here. Black has no problems in this endgame, and it's probably just equal position. No risk for black at all. So, if queen takes on c3, it is just bad because black can just win an exchange after he plays knight e2. And again, the most principal continuation is queen takes the rook. Queen takes the most valuable piece. At this point, black again has a choice between 2 forcing lines. Knight takes the knight on f3, it's a check and a capture simultaneously, and knight e2. So let's start with knight takes on f3. After knight takes on f3, you should be precise. If you automatically play g takes on f3, you blunder. You blunder that after queen g5 check, your rook on c1 is under an attack, and next move black just captures this rook, and the endgame can be better even for black, but not for white for sure. So, besides g takes on f3, white can consider different king's retreats. One of them, king f1, is just bad because of queen d3, check and checkmate. And the best bet for white is king h1. And after this move, as you can see, black does not have enough tactical resources to compensate his material disbalance. If he plays, for example, queen g5, it just attacks the rook, but it does not create the second threat, and white can either retreat with his rook or protect it with his queen, and that's it. The game is clearly better for white. So king h1 is the best move, and after this move, white has to be winning. Okay, so we are done with knight f3. Let's switch to knight e2. Another candidate move, and it was played by Swidler in his game. Now, again, white has a choice, and you should be very precise at this point. Only one move is winning, the rest lead to a drawish position. Okay, first of all, let's see which one is winning. King h1 is winning, and black has no choice. He should retake the rook. Again, if you stop at this point and decide that black equalized the game, you will be totally wrong. You cannot stop your calculation until you consider all possible forcing lines. So in this position, there are forcing lines, there are checks specifically. And queen b8, the most reasonable check here. Black has a choice between king f7 and king h7. If he plays king f7, white is easily winning after queen takes the pawn on c7, and next move, queen takes the knight on c1. So king h7, the best bet, but another check decides the game. Queen b1. Queen b1, it's double attack, check to the king, and the queen attacks the knight. So the only way to keep the knight at this position is to play knight d3. But after knight e1, black cannot keep the knight because of pin. Knight cannot legally go, so white just takes the knight with the queen or with the knight, and that's it. The game will be over for black. So only king h1 is winning, remember. And probably it was what Svidler blundered in his game. But see why not king f1, for example. What is the difference? If white plays king f1, again knight has to take the rook, queen b8, again black cannot play king f7 in view of queen takes on c7 and queen takes the knight on c1, so queen h7, again queen b1. But now, instead of knight d3, which leads to the same position after knight e1, black has a more powerful resource, is queen d3, and it's double counterattack. So it's a check to the white king, and it attacks the queen on b1. Remember, with the recall with the king on h1, it would be not a check, and white could just take the knight. But now it's illegally. White should take the queen, knight takes, and again, in this endgame, only black can fight for a win. So, but also white has the third retreat in this position, and it is king h2. So let's see what happens after king h2. Again, knight takes the rook on c1, queen b8 check, again king h7 the only move, queen b1, again now queen d3 does not work. I just take, it's not a check, and I can just take the knight on c1, so black has to play knight d3. Knight d3, knight e1, again it looks like a pin, looks like black cannot avoid it, but queen e5, again, don't stop your calculation until you consider all forcing lines. Queen e5 is the forcing line that changes the outcome. It's a check and it's double attack. It attacks the knight on e1. Again, if white king is placed on h1, it's not a check, and white can just take on d3. Now white cannot play either queen takes on d3 or knight takes on d3. He has to play g3, and after queen takes on e1, queen takes on d3 again. Black has no problem at all in this position. Okay, that's it about this example, and now let's switch to another one. Okay, as a next exercise, I would like you to calculate what happens if black plays knight takes on e3, in the positions that you can see on the diagram. So, as before, try to do it by yourself first. Try to anticipate the moves of your opponent, try to calculate as deeply as possible, and when you are done, just compare your solution with my explanation. Okay, if you want to check yourself, just push the stop button right now and be back when you are ready. Okay, so let's discuss this position. Knight takes on e3. It's a very responsible move, it's forcing line. It means that black has to be precise in his calculation. So after knight takes on e3, white has a choice. Queen takes on e3, f takes on e3, or knight takes on d4. Let's start with the simplest one. In the case of queen takes on e3, black can easily win after he plays knight c2. It's a fork, black wins the queen, and that's it. Okay, knight takes on d4 does not work because of knight c2, it's double check. White cannot take the queen, he should retreat with his king, and after king d1 or king f1, knight takes the knight on d4, and at this point it's obvious that black has more than enough compensation for the pawn. Black has very active pieces, black can create threats against the white king, and again, we can stop our calculation at this point. So the most principal continuations, f takes on e3, f takes on e3. So black has two captures here, queen takes on e3 and knight takes on e2. So if black plays knight takes on e2 in the hope that if knight takes on e2, queen takes on e3 and black restores the material balance, So it will be wrong, because white is not obligated to play knight takes on e2. He can play, for example, king takes on e2, and there is no sense for black to take the pawn on e3, because it transposes the game into endgame, in which white has extra piece, king d2 or king f2, and otherwise white seems to be pretty solid. White seems to have enough resources to protect his king in this position, even if black still has some compensation. So queen takes on e3, the most principal continuation. So black is going to play knight takes on e2 or queen takes on d2, and then knight takes on e2. So queen takes, rook takes, and if you stop at this point, you will be totally wrong. It's too early to stop your calculation. At first glance, it looks like it's unavoidable for white to lose some material, but it's not true, actually. White, in fact, can counterattack this position, and it's better to say that white has counter-tactical trick in this position. He can use the pin on the e file. So he needs to play with his king, and when knight takes the knight on e2, to play rook e1. But he cannot just play king d1 or king d1, for example, because if knight takes the knight on e2 and rook e1, black can just play with his knight, and the rook on e3 will be protected by another rook on e8. So white has to play either king d2 or king f2. And we have to decide what is better, king f2 or king d2. So let's start with king f2. In fact, after king f2, black can really equalize the game now, because after knight takes, rook e1, there is a tactical motif of fork. Knight c3, the rook on b1 is under an attack, another rook on e1 is hanging, so white has to play rook takes, and after knight d1 check, followed by knight takes on e3, black is fine in an endgame, the same amount of pawns, and yeah, no problems. So, king d2, the best bet for white, knight takes the knight, and again rook e1. So, in this position, black can still play knight c3, but besides, there is additional resource of knight g3. So, if you calculate only knight c3, again, you are not totally correct. You need also to anticipate what happens after knight g3. So, let's start with knight g3. After knight g3, the rook on e1 is hanging, and for this reason white cannot just take the knight. If white takes the rook on e3 as before, black could play knight f1. If white just retreats with the rook, black can go back with his knight, knight e2. So, if white is fighting for the win in this position, he should move his knight, knight b3. And surprisingly, black realizes that it's not enough for him just to trade off the rooks. If rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, and king takes, then the knight is trapped. There are no squares for knight besides h1 square, but if knight goes to h1, white can easily capture it by playing king f1, king g1, and king takes the knight on h1. So white is winning. Rook e2, the best practical chance for black. White has to take, rook takes, and again, white can play king c3 in this position, and knight still does not have squares to retreat. Black has to give up this knight, rook takes, h takes, rook takes, and I believe that this position white has to be better, in spite of the fact that black has 3 pawns. On the king's side, white seems to be on time to stop this pawn, to coordinate his pieces, and to start advancing his own passed pawn on the d file. So, I think white has to be winning here. Okay, we are done with knight g3, let's switch to knight c3, another candidate move that we should anticipate. Again, if b takes on c3, it's just bad because of rook e1, black is winning. white cannot go with his e1 rook because the rook on b1 is hanging, and the only move actually just rook takes the rook. Knight takes the rook on b1 and king e2. King e2. It's the only move. King protects the rook. Again, if black just trade off the rook, after rook takes, king takes, white has a simple plan how to trap the knight. He wants to play king e2, king d1, king c2, and black is absolutely helpless. So, probably the best bet for black is to play rook c8, but after king d1, in spite of the fact that white cannot immediately capture this knight, because black takes control over the c-file, the position of white is obviously better here, because black plays without the knight is cut off, the knight is out of play, white can use his rook to attack the pawn on the 7th rank, or can play rook e2, rook c2 at some point, and just as an alternative, white can advance his d-pawn, and it looks like, again, white has extra piece in this position, in spite of the nominal material balance. Okay, that's it about this example and about calculation today. To sum up, my recommendation to you: every time when you calculate variation, just apply the concepts of prophylactic thinking and candidate moves. Make a list of candidate moves for yourself and for your opponent. Try to take into consideration, first of all, forcing lines, checks, captures, and moves with a threat. And I sincerely believe if you are doing so, it will help you to be more precise in your calculation and to reduce the amount of blunders in your games.